In World War II, the enemy was not always on the other side of the wire. Some of the most dangerous weapons on the battlefield were the ones soldiers were ordered to carry, fire, and trust with their lives. This is every weapon that turned on the people using it. Welcome back. Today we are covering 19 weapons from World War II that killed, maimed, or seriously injured their own operators. We start with the Sten Gun, British. This 9mm submachine gun became one of the most produced weapons of the entire war, with over 4 million manufactured, and it cost just over £2 to make, which should have been the first warning sign. The open bolt design meant that if the weapon was dropped with a round in the chamber, the bolt could travel forward under impact and fire without anyone touching the trigger. Accidental discharges during training exercises and field operations are documented throughout British and Commonwealth forces. It also had a documented tendency to fire when the magazine was pressed sideways against a surface, because the magazine housing doubled as the forward grip, and that pressure could move the bolt. The Sten was effective, cheap, and genuinely unreliable in ways that cost lives before anyone fired at the enemy. Next, we have the Boys anti-tank rifle, British. This bolt-action anti-tank rifle fired a .55 caliber cartridge, generating recoil forces so violent that documented injuries included fractured collarbones, dislocated shoulders, severe soft tissue damage, and permanent hearing loss from a single session of firing without proper ear protection. By 1942, it was already obsolete against the frontal armor of most German tanks, meaning operators were absorbing serious, career-ending physical damage in exchange for minimal tactical effectiveness. The muzzle brake reduced recoil somewhat, but not nearly enough to make sustained firing anything other than physically brutal. British soldiers who fired the Boys frequently referred to it as a weapon that punished the shooter regardless of whether it hit anything. It remained in service long after it should have been retired, purely because a replacement was not available. Let's continue with the PIAT, British. The projector infantry anti-tank required the operator to compress an internal spring with over 200 pounds of force to cock the weapon before the first shot, which in the field, lying flat under fire, was a physical test that many soldiers genuinely struggled to complete. If the spring was improperly set or only partially compressed, firing the weapon could cause the propellant cartridge to detonate prematurely inside the tube, directly in the operator's hands. Firing from inside a building, bunker, or any enclosed space generated a concussive backblast that was documented to incapacitate or kill the operator. Despite all of this, the PIAT produced some of the most remarkable acts of close-quarters anti-armor bravery of the entire war, including multiple Victoria Cross actions. It was a weapon that demanded an extraordinary level of physical courage just to operate under normal conditions. Next, we have the number 82 Gammon Grenade, British. This was a stockinette fabric bag filled with plastic explosive, used primarily by British and Commonwealth paratroopers because it was light, adaptable, and could be packed with whatever explosive was available. The exposed and flexible design meant the bag could snag on equipment webbing, be torn by thorns or wire, or be improperly assembled during the chaos of a night drop. In any of which cases, the arming tape could deploy unintentionally. Premature detonations during operations in Normandy and at Arnhem in 1944 are historically recorded in after-action reports. The weapon also had no standardized fill weight, meaning the blast radius was inconsistent and sometimes larger than the operator expected. It was the kind of improvised solution that worked until it very suddenly did not. Moving on to the Hawkins Mine, number 75, British. This anti-tank blast mine was designed to be rapidly scattered across roads and tracks to disable enemy vehicle traffic during delaying actions and retreats. The critical problem was that units laying them under pressure frequently failed to accurately record the exact positions of every mine before withdrawing. Follow-on Allied vehicles, including British, Canadian, and American trucks and armored cars, subsequently drove over their own unrecorded minefields. Multiple documented incidents of Allied vehicles and personnel being killed by improperly charted Hawkins Mine positions appear in British Army After Action reports from Northwest Europe. A weapon designed to stop the enemy had a well-documented secondary function of stopping friendly forces instead. We have the Bazooka M1 American. The original M1 version of the rocket launcher produced a backblast extending several meters behind the tube on firing, which in open terrain was manageable, but in urban combat, vehicle interiors, or confined field positions became immediately lethal to the operator or the loader standing behind him. Multiple documented incidents occurred during the fighting in North Africa and Italy, where operators fired the M1 from inside rooms or near walls, redirecting the backblast onto themselves. The weapon also had issues with rocket motor misfires, leaving a live round partially armed inside the tube, a situation with very few good outcomes. Later versions, including the M9 and the improved M101, addressed some of these issues, but the early production M1 caused considerable self-inflicted casualties before those lessons were fully absorbed. It was a weapon that required as much situational awareness about your own position as it did about the target. Next is the rifle grenade used across all armies. The Lee Enfield, the Carabiner 98K, the M1 Garand, and numerous other rifles were fitted with grenade launchers throughout the war. And across all armies, the documented causes of self-inflicted casualties followed a consistent and avoidable pattern. Operators fired with a standard ball cartridge instead of the required blank propellant cartridge, causing the grenade to detonate at or immediately beyond the muzzle. Incorrect seating of the grenade on the launcher cup meant the grenade body was partially obstructing the barrel on firing. Barrel bursts from these causes are recorded in British, American, German, and Soviet forces throughout every theater of the war. The rifle grenade was tactically valuable and technically reliable when used correctly, and that qualifier was the problem. Let's continue with the Molotov cocktail, Soviet and Finnish. Improvised incendiary weapons made from glass bottles filled with fuel and fitted with a burning wick were used extensively during the Finnish Winter War of 1939 to 1940, continued in use by Soviet forces across the Eastern Front. The improvised nature of production meant fuel caps were inconsistently sealed, wicks were of variable quality, and glass bottles broke prematurely under the stress of throwing, before leaving the thrower's hand. Soldiers igniting themselves during preparation or on throwing are documented throughout first-hand accounts of the Winter War and the early Eastern Front fighting. The mixture of petrol and tar used in Finnish versions burned at extremely high temperatures and adhered to skin and clothing, making accidental contact especially severe. It was a weapon born of absolute necessity and produced under conditions that made quality control essentially impossible. Moving on to the Stielhandgranate, German. The German stick grenade used a pull-cord ignition system running through the hollow wooden handle, activated by unscrewing the base cap and pulling a porcelain ball on a cord. If the base cap was loose, if the porcelain ball snagged on webbing or vegetation, or if the cap was accidentally unscrewed during carrying, the fuse activated silently and immediately without any outward sign visible to the soldier. The standard fuse delay was approximately 4 to 5 seconds, leaving no meaningful time to react once the fuse was running. Premature detonations during carrying and transport are documented throughout German army records across all theaters from North Africa to the Eastern Front. The design was simple and effective when handled correctly, and catastrophic when it was not. We have the Panzerfaust German. This single-shot disposable anti-tank launcher was one of the most effective infantry anti-armor weapons of the war, capable of penetrating over 200 millimeters of steel armor. But it produced a substantial backblast cone extending over 3 meters behind the tube on firing. When operators fired from inside buildings, from behind walls with insufficient clearance, from bunkers, or from narrow trenches, that backblast had nowhere to go except back onto the operator. German Army training manuals and operational field instructions issued explicit and repeated warnings about minimum clearance requirements that were routinely disregarded under the pressure of close-range tank engagements. Documented deaths and severe burns among Panzerfaust operators in urban fighting, particularly during the battles for German cities in 1945, are recorded in both German and Allied after-action reports. It was a weapon that demanded discipline and clear space at a point in the war when German forces had neither in adequate supply. Next, we have the Hafthohlladung German. This magnetic-shaped charge anti-tank mine was designed to be physically carried to an enemy tank by a soldier on foot and attached directly to the hull armor by its 4 permanent magnets. To place the charge, the operator had to approach an active enemy tank close enough to touch it, directly entering the tank's immediate defensive zone where hull machine guns, the cruise pistols, and any supporting infantry were all aimed and ready. The standard fuse delay after placement was approximately 7.5 seconds, giving the operator a narrow window to move clear before detonation. Casualty rates among Hafthohlladung operators were extremely high, and the weapon was ultimately a reflection of how desperate the tactical situation had become for German infantry facing Allied armor. Awarding soldiers for successful Hafthohlladung attacks required first acknowledging that the mission itself was close to suicidal. Let's talk about the S-Mine German. The Shrapnel Mine 35, known to Allied troops as the Bouncing Betty, was one of the most feared anti-personnel mines of the war. When German forces conducted rapid retreats across the Eastern Front from 1943 onward, minefield records were frequently incomplete, lost, or simply not passed to follow-on units. German infantry and vehicle columns subsequently advanced across their own unmarked minefields, triggering the same weapons they had laid weeks or months earlier. The S-Mine functioned by launching a small charge to waist height before detonating and projecting steel ball bearings in all directions. A mechanism that was equally indiscriminate about the nationality of whoever triggered it. Documented German casualties from their own S-Mine fields during the retreats of the final 2 years of the war are recorded in German divisional records and post-war analysis. Moving on to the Nebelwerfer German. This multi-barrel rocket artillery system was tactically effective and psychologically devastating to Allied troops, producing the distinctive wailing sound that earned it the Allied nickname Moaning Mini. The fundamental problem was that the act of firing the Nebelwerfer simultaneously and precisely identified the crew's position to every enemy artillery observer within hearing range. Counter-battery fire from Allied artillery on Nebelwerfer positions was rapid, accurate, and systematically prioritized because suppressing them was a stated tactical objective. Early production propellant charges also produced documented instances of backfire at the launcher, directly injuring or killing the crew. The Nebelwerfer crew's life expectancy after opening fire was measured not in how long they survived after engaging the enemy, but in how long it took Allied artillery to respond. We have the Type 94 pistol, Japanese. This 8mm semi-automatic pistol was issued to Japanese officers and was distinguished by a design flaw so fundamental it is still studied today. The trigger bar, the component that mechanically connects the trigger to the firing mechanism, ran along the outside of the left side of the frame and was fully exposed and unprotected. Direct external pressure on this trigger bar from holstering, from rough handling, or from being pressed against any surface could fire the weapon without the trigger ever being touched. Accidental discharges and resulting deaths and injuries among Japanese officers are documented throughout Pacific Theater records. It is unclear whether the designers were aware of the flaw before production began, which is somehow not a reassuring alternative to assuming they were not. Next is the flamethrower used across all armies. The American M2, the German Flammenwerfer 41, and the Japanese Type 93 all operated on the same principle and shared the same critical vulnerability. The pressurized fuel tanks strapped to the operator's back contained enough incendiary material to sustain approximately 8 to 10 seconds of continuous flame projection. And a single enemy bullet or shell fragment penetrating those tanks caused immediate and catastrophic ignition. Flamethrower operators were priority targets for enemy snipers across every theater, specifically because eliminating them was straightforward and the results were guaranteed. Casualty rates among flamethrower operators were among the highest of any specialist infantry role in the war across all armies that fielded them. They were also documented as the soldiers most frequently targeted first when a position was engaged, making the weapon as much a liability as an asset from the moment the operator stepped into the open. Let's continue with the Type 93 Long Lance Torpedo, Japanese. This was the most powerful and longest-ranged surface-launched torpedo of the entire war, with a range of approximately 40 kilometers at 40 knots, far exceeding anything the United States Navy fielded. Its propulsion system used a mixture of pure oxygen and kerosene, which eliminated the visible bubble trail that air-powered torpedoes produced and gave it an enormous range advantage. The same pure oxygen system that made it operationally superior made it extraordinarily dangerous aboard the ships carrying it. When Japanese destroyers and cruisers carrying Long Lance torpedoes were hit by enemy gunfire or bombs, the oxygen-fed secondary explosions that resulted from torpedo detonation were catastrophic and frequently sank or mission-killed vessels that might otherwise have survived the initial hit. Multiple Japanese warships lost during the Guadalcanal campaign suffered devastating secondary explosions directly attributed to their own Long Lance torpedo magazines. Moving on to the Messerschmitt Me 163 Komet, German. This was the world's first operational rocket-powered interceptor aircraft, and also one of the most dangerous aircraft ever issued to a combat unit, with the distinction that most of its danger was directed at its own pilot. It was powered by two hypergolic propellants, T-Stoff, which was highly concentrated hydrogen peroxide, and C-Stoff, a mixture of hydrazine hydrate and methanol, which ignited spontaneously and violently on contact with each other, and also reacted catastrophically with organic material, including human tissue. Documented incidents of ground crew and pilots being dissolved or seriously burned by fuel leaks are recorded at multiple Komet operational bases. The landing procedure required the pilot to touch down on a retractable belly skid after dropping the wheeled takeoff dolly, and if any residual propellant remained in the tanks at landing, the impact could cause detonation. Of the approximately 370 Me-163 pilots trained and assigned, historical analysis indicates that significantly more were lost to the aircraft's own systems than to enemy action, which for a frontline combat aircraft is a record of a very particular kind. We have the Katyusha BM-13 rocket launcher, Soviet. This multiple rocket launcher system became one of the most iconic weapons of the Eastern Front and one of the most psychologically devastating area weapons of the war. Early production versions suffered documented incidents of rockets failing to clear the launch rails cleanly on ignition, detonating at or immediately above the launcher and killing or wounding the crew. The launch signature, produced by a full salvo, a massive simultaneous column of fire, smoke, and sound, was visible and audible at extreme distances and drew immediate and accurate German counter-battery artillery fired directly onto the firing position. Soviet tactical doctrine recognized this and required Katyusha units to fire and immediately relocate, a procedure that was not always executed in time under combat pressure. Soviet records from the early Eastern Front campaigns document significant crew casualties from both the mechanical failure mode and the counter-battery response that every single launch invited. And finally, we have the Lunge Mine Type 99, Japanese. This was a shaped anti-tank charge containing approximately 3 kilograms of explosive. Mounted at the tip of a 2-meter wooden pole with 3 stabilizing side fins designed to hold it perpendicular to the armor surface on impact. The operator was required to physically run toward an enemy tank under fire, close the distance to arm's reach, and drive the tip of the pole against the tank hull with sufficient force to detonate the charge on contact. There was no fuse delay. There was no mechanism for the operator to clear the blast radius. Survival was not operationally possible and was not intended by the design. It was issued to Japanese infantry as a formal last-resort anti-armor tactic when no other means were available, and soldiers were trained specifically in its use. It remains one of the clearest examples in the entire war of a weapon that defined the difference between an act of warfare and an act of sacrifice.